Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome. Glad to be back with all of you. Hopefully, it'll be a consistent ride from now till the end of the course. Um, let's go ahead and start as we usually do with a few prayers. So, let me share that on the screen. Again, we'll just do the praise to Shakyamuni Buddha once together, and then we'll go on to refuge. I'm sorry, to the mandala offering, and then refuge and bodhicitta. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, four continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Hidam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chanyen gi pe sonam gi dola penchir sangye drupar shod Sangye chodang soki choknam la Jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chenyen gi pe sanam gi dola penchir sangye drupar shog. Okay, let's do a short meditation as usual, spending the first few minutes kind of focusing the mind using the breath. And you can use whatever technique you prefer with the breath. And then I'll lead you in a short reflection to set our motivation together before we begin the class. So let's just go ahead and start our meditation now then. Now let's set our motivation for our time together. And let's do this by reflecting on the basic teaching the Buddha gave, which is that all the problems we see in our lives and in the world are arising from the difficulties we have in our own minds. The root of ignorance that is driving the whole show, this misunderstanding of the nature of reality. And then, of course, the problematic minds that we have, which arise from that. The craving, the desire, attachment, all that energy. And then, of course, what happens when we don't get what we want. The minds of aversion, irritation, anger, hatred, rage. Whenever we turn our minds towards the Dharma, it's always to help us to address that fundamental problem, the difficulties that we have in our own minds with not seeing things correctly and having distorted attitudes on the basis of that, which then is the cause for our own suffering, our own negative karma, all the things we engage in that simply perpetuate our stay in samsara and keep us from being enlightened. That's the first step always, is that we do this work. We turn our minds towards the Dharma and the Lamrim in particular, because we ourselves are suffering due to these distorted states of mind and everything that is built upon them. Then when we look at our world, and certainly in our times right now, we can see the afflictions manifesting in so many ways that are harmful to the beings in this world as well as the planet itself. And we understand the mechanism by which all this is happening. If it wasn't for the ignorance that's at the root of their difficulties, if it wasn't for all of the distorted states of mind they build on top of that, and then the negative karma they engage in and all of the suffering that ensues, if it wasn't for that, these beings would be at peace. Moreover, they would have attained a more ideal state in which to interact with each other, be in this world. So when we see the suffering of the world around us, it's important that we have that understanding. We know why the suffering is occurring. It's all due to ignorance and the delusions. So when we turn our minds towards the Dharma tonight, it's not just for freeing ourselves from these causes, but to help to free all beings from what is keeping them bound in samsara and in an unenlightened existence. And the ideal way to help them is to become a Buddha for their sake. So we generate that motivation of bodhicitta, the wish to help all these beings in the best way possible by becoming a Buddha ourselves. Let us hold that motivation very deeply for our time together tonight. So everything we discuss becomes the cause to lead us on that path to attaining that state, and then to be able to help others to do the same. And you can open your eyes fully, and we'll come back into the space together. Okay, so I did want to just check in with where we're at in this course, because again, we had a couple of Thursdays where we had a little bit of a break, and hopefully you've caught up with any reading or any, other things you might need to do during that time. We're about one session behind, essentially, from where the original schedule was. I'm not going to change the schedule because I think it's perfectly fine, and there's only a few sessions left in this first part of the middle-length Lamrim course. But the material we're going to cover tonight is simply a continuation of what we had for session 8, which is essentially the meditation session part 2. I'm going to continue on and finish that section, and I think it'll probably take the rest of this evening. So I'm not planning on going into the material we actually had planned for tonight. So if you've prepared that, that's fine. You'll be ready for next week. Next week, we'll go into the freedoms and endowments of this life, which is really the second main topic for meditation in this Lamrim text. The first one was, of course, our relying upon the spiritual teacher. So again, this is an important topic. We may take a little more than that session. That'll be on April 1st, next Wednesday. And then, of course, April 8th and 9th, or 8th and 15th, sorry, 8th and 15th, I had added as additional sessions because I knew it would probably take me a little more time here and there to go through all the material. So we'll cover the paths of the three types of persons, either April 8th or even going some of it maybe into the 15th. But even if we have time on the 15th, we'll do just a sort of review to go over the course that we started in January, just covering the main topics, what have you. So we'll fill the time, no problem there. I might mention that we are going to have a little bit of a break between April 15th and when we start part two, because I'm going to be away from May 2nd through 14th, which will essentially cover two of the Thursdays, I'm sorry, Wednesdays. However, I'm going to teach on the 13th. I know that that night I will be away, but I will be able to squeeze in that first teaching. So we're going to start the next part of this on May 13th. And I'll have the full schedule for all of that, everything posted soon. I'll get that to Venerable Dundrup and we'll get that all arranged for part two. And that will probably take us somewhere into, I don't remember the exact date, sometime in the fall, I think, maybe late summer. Think just late summer. Then we do part three. I've already got that mapped out, and that'll take us to pretty much the end of the year. Part four will start in 2027. But I'm just giving you a preview of that. Now, what happens between April 15th and May 13th is that those of you who would like to participate by taking the test for that first part, it'll be based on all the homework questions. So there's nothing that's going to be a surprise. The only surprise is that you'll show up there and there will be less questions for you to answer than what you prepared for, no doubt, because what I do ahead of time is I give people the numbers of questions that I want them to study, and then there's a selection of those that are in the final test. So you won't even have to, do all of those. It's not very difficult, I don't think. I don't know. The way I do exams or tests is not really too bad. So again, just keep that in mind. That's going to give you a few weeks there, almost 4 weeks in total, that if you want to study for the test on your own and take it, it'll be on an honor system. You'll be able to take it on your own. I'll announce all that and get the details out to you in that final class on April 15th. But I just wanted to give a little preview of that since we are getting near the end of this course. And that will happen at the end of each of these 4 parts, so that there won't be one big test on a year and a half or 2 years of material, however long it takes me to finish this. So I think it's really kind of too much for people. There is obviously the basic program exam that follows the entire 9 subjects, and that's something that, you study for 3 months. That's a whole different thing. But for this, I think it's easier if people just do one little chunk at a time. All right. So let's get back into the text. What we were covering in the previous classes, the last 2 classes we had, was essentially the meditation session. And so we talked in the beginning about the preparatory practices, preliminary practices, kind of what you do before the session, all the things that need to happen in order to have your actual session of meditating on the Lamrim. We went through that as well, and kind of how you conduct that part of it. And I went through a few of the materials that I provided to you that are useful, and hopefully, meditating on those sections of the Lamrim. Right now, really, again, we only have the topic of the spiritual teacher to meditate on, because that's the only kind of meditation topic that we've covered formally. We've got, again, the perfect human rebirth, the freedoms and endowments, that's coming up next week. And so that will be another meditation topic for you to begin to work with. And if you can put that whole structure together for the preliminaries and then the actual meditation, and then, of course, at the end, how to dedicate, what have you. That's where we left off the last time we were together 2 weeks ago. So tonight, what we're going to do is we're going to move into what do you do between sessions? Because obviously we spend a lot of time between sessions. If you're doing more sessions than, certainly most of us, well, then maybe there's not that much time between sessions. But most of us have maybe 2 sessions, might be do one at the beginning of the day, one at the end of the day, if we feel we can muster up the strength for that and time for that. But, what happens in that period between? And what are the things we need to kind of attend to complement what we're doing in our meditation? So that's the idea behind this next section. And I thought I would start, and actually I just realized now that I didn't pull up the file. To pull up, it only takes a second here. My PowerPoint slides, there they are. Okay. And just get to the right place, and it says where I left off, and let me do that. Okay, so I will pull this up right now. Go to my slides because, again, there's a little introductory thing in regard to this from Geshe Sopa's commentary on the Lamrim Chenmo, the great treatise. He says, in fact, we spend most of our time in between sessions. While the formal sessions are very important, if you really have an interest in practice, you must be concerned with how you act during non-session time. This is the thing, is we sit on the cushion in order to do the work on our minds, but then when we get up off the cushion, we have to make sure that that work sticks, that there's some way of reinforcing it in our behavior with others and how we are going about our day. He says this is a very important topic because the quality of a meditation session depends a great deal on what happens during the time you are not meditating. If you keep a very tight focus with sharp concentration during the meditation session, but after you get up, you let your mind run completely wild, your practice will not work. Sometimes I use the example of, like, if you imagine if you had all these wild horses and you're spending all this time getting them corralled, which is what we're essentially doing in our meditation session. And then you leave the gate open when you get up and, go off to do your other stuff. Of course, all the horses are going to disappear, right? That's kind of the analogy I use for it. I see all my kind of wild horses go crazy during the day. We want to kind of keep our horses tame throughout the day, keep them somewhat contained and corralled. Therefore, he says, Tsongkhapa explains what to do during breaks between meditation sessions. He provides an extensive explanation here during the first mention of post-session practice. He does not repeat this explanation for every topic. It is understood that you carry these methods over to all the other steps on the path. So again, this is something we would carry over and do with regard to every one of the topics. Oh, and by the way, there were a few questions that I said I would provide answers to. I'll look at that and get that to you at the end. I think there were a few things where some people brought up some points in the last session, right? I think so. And I took a note of them, and I think I had some luck in locating one thing. But anyway, I'll get to that later. Let's stick with the topic we have at hand already. So let's go to our text and see what Tsongkhapa has to say about this, because again, this is an important part of our practice, as Geshe Sopa was saying. And so let's look at the advice that we're getting. What to do in the periods between sessions. Tsongkhapa says, whoops, let me make it bigger, a little more of the screen. Generally speaking, numerous practices enhance the object between sessions, such as prostration, circumambulation, and recitation. Most of you know prostrations. We talked about the practice of prostration as the first limb of the seven limbs, sorry. I don't know where 8 came from. And then circumambulation is the kind of going around holy objects, such as stupas, statues, and so on, or shrines, what have you. And then recitation, reciting, mantra, reciting sutra, reciting whatever. However, the main point is that if you make an effort in the session itself, but then during the intervals between sessions, you carelessly let go of the causes for maintaining your focus by not relying on mindfulness and vigilance of the observed object along with its subjective aspect, the outcome will be very little. The note explains this idea of the observed object. We have observed objects, which are the things that we are observing when we are engaged in our 5 senses consciousnesses, as well as our mental consciousness. But then our mental consciousness has a subjective aspect here in particular around the teachings. So we are kind of cultivating a thought about the teachings. The example that's used in the footnote here is the idea of when we are observing sentient beings. It says, for example, when meditating on compassion, the object is sentient beings, and the subjective aspect is any of the 3. Observing those sentient beings as suffering, that's the main one when we're cultivating compassion, right? We are trying to see them through the lens of their suffering. As impermanent, which these are actually the 3 types of compassion I talked about in a course I did earlier this year at Tibetan Buddhist here. The second one where we observe them as impermanent, because that impermanence is also a source of suffering for sentient beings because they cling to the opposite. Them being permanent rather than impermanent. And then finally, sentient beings as empty of inherent nature, which is speaking to their emptiness, whereas sentient beings, again, cause a lot of their own suffering because they cling to themselves as having inherent nature. So the idea here is that you always have a subjective aspect in regard to a particular observed object. And so it's kind of keeping through, to go back here, what to do, that says here, having mindfulness and vigilance of the observed object and the subjective aspect. So say you are, again, through your practice, you are meditating on your preciousness of this human life. Again, the topic we'll go into next week. Well, then when you get up off your cushion, whatever was your subjective aspect in observing the particular topics, you want to hold on to that and have some awareness of it as well as that observed object through these two factors. These two factors are going to come into play a lot. We're going to see them a little bit later tonight, but the really major factors in developing deeper concentration. The first one is mindfulness, which is non-forgetfulness with regard to those objects, that object that is being observed in the subjective aspect. It's meaning that you're not going to let the mind stray away from that. You're going to keep the mind attentive to that, not forgetting it. Vigilance, or sometimes called introspection, is the force of our minds to kind of look in and see the quality of our behavior at that time. So we use it in meditation to check the quality of our meditation, but in off the cushion, we want to check, well, where is my mind right now? Am I getting totally caught up in sense objects and doing all kinds of things I'm not supposed to do? If I am, then we need to correct my mind, get my kind of mindfulness of the way I want to be in the world reestablished, and then proceed from there. So this introspection or vigilance plays an important role of kind of being the security guard in a sense. It sort of checks up and makes sure that we're not going completely astray. So that's the idea behind those two, playing a role in regard to whatever it is that we've been meditating on, trying to carry that over into our daily life. So it says then, therefore, towards the top here, between sessions, you also need to read Dharma texts presenting that object. So you would read, for example, well, like the book that I mentioned for the first topic, The Spiritual Teacher, there's that wonderful book of Lama Zopa Rinpoche's teachings on this topic called The Heart of the Path. And if in regard to perfect human rebirth, there's a book called Perfect Human Rebirth, which is Rinpoche's teachings on that subject. So you could read those, or you could read any Lamrim text. But it's good to have some study of that topic between the sessions so that you're reinforcing your learning and your awareness. And then, of course, as he says here, recall it again and again. Recall the topics, recall how you are to think about those topics. With regard to the spiritual teacher, it's reflecting on the kindness and the thoughts of kind of dedicating yourself to them and their advice. And then with regard to the precious human rebirth, that perfect rebirth, we want to make sure that we recall how opportune this life is and how difficult it is to find. And we want to be able to hold it very importantly so that we don't waste this life. That's the idea behind those aspects that we want to hold on to. And then we, again, are reminded of those through our own Dharma reading and study during the day. Accumulate by various means the conditions that are favorable for the arising of excellent qualities, and purify by various means the adverse conditions, the obstructions. Well, this is referring to, once more, our accumulation of merit and our purification of negativities. That should be a part of every day. So we engage in what activities we can to enhance our merit, our positive potential, and then to purify negativities, especially if we do a purification practice at the end of every day, which we'll get to in more detail when we get to the teachings on karma. But we did touch on it in regard to the limb of confession among the 7 limbs. Continuing, it says, your determination regarding the vows you have promised to uphold, the basis of everything, should be reaffirmed regularly. So again, if you do hold vows, it's important that you have some part of your day where you reaffirm that. And usually that's after your purification. So when you make the kind of resolve to refrain from those actions in the future as the 4th opponent power, where we touched on those briefly, then you make that commitment to upholding your vows. So again, this is just the introduction to this whole idea of the time between sessions. And then there's a little introduction into these 4 practices. Apart from that, train in the collection of the following 4 causes for an easy arising of the paths of shamatha and special insight. Remember, shamatha is our calm abiding meditation. That is a real, crown practice that we want to engage in. Further on, we'll get instructions. That'll be in part 4 of this course. And of course, special insight is the insight into emptiness, vipassana, which we'll talk about as well in part 4 in more detail. Okay, so we've got these 4 practices we're being introduced to, these 4 causes, so that we can get those realizations very easy. The first one is restraining the sense doors. When the 6 consciousnesses arise, in dependence upon objects and sense powers, attachment and anger end up arising in the mental consciousness towards the 6 pleasant and the 6 unpleasant objects. Let me take it off screen for just a moment. Some of you may have studied, there's another topic in the Lamrim, or I'm sorry, in the basic program teachings besides the Lamrim that's called awareness and knowers. And essentially it goes into how the mind knows. One part of it is sort of Buddhist sort of ontology, kind of how the mind functions. And the other one is Buddhist psychology. I'm sorry, epistemology, not ontology, epistemology. Epistemology is all about kind of how the mind is able to know its objects and the various ways of knowing. And essentially, when we talk about in that subject, how the mind knows, we have those six consciousnesses, the five sense consciousness and the mental consciousness. All of them, of course, are arising in relation to objects. You always need some sort of object. For the mental consciousness, for our conceptual mind, of course, we often have a mental object, which is an idea of the objects that we are thinking about or knowing. For our five sense consciousnesses, they, of course, have their respective objects. For the eye consciousness, our visual form. For the ear consciousness, sound, and so on. And then for the nose, tongue, and body consciousnesses, we have, smells or odors, tastes, and then tangible objects. So all of these have their respective objects. And the idea behind this is that whenever we have a moment where those consciousnesses arise, independence upon what we often call the sense powers. The sense powers are not the physical gross matter that we have in our eyeballs, for example, or our eardrum and what have you, or our tongue or our nose, or even across our whole body where we've got tactile sensation. We're not talking about that kind of coarser physical element. In Buddhism, they say there's actually a very subtle phenomenon that's called the sense powers. This is sort of subtle matter that can be seen by certain clairvoyants, but essentially this is embedded within each of these physical objects. So it's kind of a way of empowering those organs to know those various objects. So again, modern science, of course, hasn't detected these sorts of things, but in Buddhism, they say again that very subtle minds who have been trained through deep concentration can have clairvoyances that can see this subtle matter. So essentially, these sense, if you have a problem with that concept, you can simply say, well, then the five sense physical objects, the eyeballs, the eardrum, what have you, all of this are the kind of basis upon which we are able to receive that data. So you have three things involved always. You have the object, and then you have some sense power that allows you to know that object. And then you have the sense consciousness that arises in dependence upon those. So all those three come together in a sense. So what's being said here is whenever we have that happening with the five senses, or even when our mental consciousness gets kind of distracted by various things we're thinking about, because of course we have memory of objects that we've experienced, and we have ideas about people that we have issues with or what have you. Whenever those things arise, there's going to be probably one of two major feeling tones that are occurring. There are said to be three, but the third one is neutral. The two that we really get caught up in, of course, are whenever anything pleasant comes into our field of experience, that causes the mind of attachment to arise. Then whenever anything unpleasant comes into our field of experience, we have the mind of aversion, anger, irritation, all those things arise, right? So we essentially have throughout our day many of these objects, either through our external world that the senses are knowing, or through our memory of things, through our mental consciousness, that we are bringing these things into our field of experience and causing our anger and attachment to arise. And of course, that's going to be disturbing to the mind. If we spend our whole day after sitting in our calm meditation on our cushion, getting distracted in that way through these arising of these various objects and being kind of seen in that distorted manner, well, then we're not going to have much luck, right? Because we're going to end up spending our whole day in kind of crazy, confused states of mind. We'll have to calm the mind down again when we go sit in the evening, and then we'll go to bed and wake up in the morning and have to do the whole thing over again. So the idea is that restraining, as it says there at the very bottom of the screen, restraining the sense doors guards against their arising. So again, the footnote on here just explains what I explained about the way that things arise in dependence upon those three factors. But essentially, this is our job during the day, is to kind of refrain from getting too tangled up in all these various things. Sure, you're going to have to eat and you're going to have to kind of go about your day interacting with people. Those are parts of most of our lives, right? If you're in retreat, it's going to be a little different, obviously, because hopefully you can then monitor, the contact you have with outside things, and you can, not get too caught up in food and all the other things that we normally get caught up in. But the idea is that when we have those things, it's best to guard our minds so that we aren't getting kind of caught up in those. Now, again, this is already touching on a topic that we're not going to see until part 2 of this course, which is when we go into the delusions, the afflictions, and how to work with them and so on. That's going to be coming up in that second part. But nonetheless, most of you have been around the Dharma a while. You know some of these techniques for working with all of this. Just know that this is part of our job between sessions to make sure that our mind stays somewhat calm. In regard to this topic, I wanted to share a little bit of what Geshe Sopa says on this. In regard to restraining the sense doors, he says the instrument for protecting the doors of the senses is mindfulness, which we just talked about, right? That was the introduction of this, said we need mindfulness and vigilance in order to refrain from, ruining our time between sessions and really not complementing what we're doing in our meditation sessions. He goes on to say, mindfulness is constantly maintaining awareness of what is happening in your mind. It means kind of that attentive, non-forgetfulness with regard to what is going on in my mind and in my way of behaving on the basis of my mind. It should always have 2 qualities. It must be diligent, never letting down its guard, and it must be intense and active. So mindfulness is a very, powerful presence we can have and bring to what we are doing. It's not simply observing those things. It's kind of keeping in mind what we want to do. And you can observe the mind go crazy with attachment. Excuse me, but that doesn't do much good, because then we're going to end up getting kind of drowning in our attachment. But we want to have a mind that watches to see when attachment is beginning to arise. Through our mindfulness of what's going on there, then we, of course, make corrections. Rather than getting entangled with that object and seeing the attachment grow, we will find a way of detaching from it, or to have an adjustment of our mind so that we see, for example, the unattractive qualities of that object, so the attachment is lessened. Again, we're going to talk about all those kinds of antidotes at a later point. But we have to have some way of guarding it, and mindfulness is one of the main factors. Mindfulness is like a strong training rope or chain that ties a wild elephant to a sturdy pillar. In this analogy, the wild elephant is the mind that has to be restrained. Sometimes we talk about monkey mind, but many times in the text they refer to the mind as a wild elephant. Apparently, and yeah, in places like we hear reports occasionally of that, right, in India, where a wild elephant will like go through a town and completely demolish all the buildings, what have you, because you can do a lot of damage with our minds as well, right, in a similar manner. So that's the mind that has to be restrained. It has to be kind of kept in check. The chain, of course, that keeps it in place is mindfulness. And the pillar is virtuous activity. We want to kind of be, if you're going to tie the elephant to the pillar, you want to have your mind tied to virtuous activity, meaning maintaining virtuous states of mind, not allowing the mind to have the delusions arising, and particularly, again, attachment, anger, though also the other afflictions, pride, jealousy, what have you. With mindfulness, you are constantly on the alert to detect when your mind tries to move toward dangerous, non-virtuous actions. You pull it back where it belongs with the chain of mindfulness. And of course, you might need introspection in there. He doesn't talk about that in this regard, but we talked about it earlier. If you don't have kind of some ability to check up occasionally, well, then you may have already gotten caught up in those objects. You're already heading in a non-virtuous direction. So with your introspection or vigilance detecting that, then you again reassert your mindfulness and pull the mind back to a more virtuous state. With mindfulness, you become aware of when and how your sense faculties function. The 6 sense faculties are the 5 physical sense organs plus the mental faculty. These are the doors of the body, speech, and mind. Let me just take a little drink of water. Having allergies here in New Mexico. I came back from California and I have them worse here than I did there. I don't know. Got more stuff growing here, perhaps. Okay. That should be better. When the sense faculties engage their respective objects, a sense consciousness arises, followed by a mental consciousness. This mental consciousness labels the object and imputes a quality, attractive or unattractive, pleasant or unpleasant, to it. Of course, this is a kind of somewhat in error because there is nothing from the side of the object that makes it that. This is our own karmic experience of that object that we are then labeling as such. Oh, this is attractive. This is pleasant. I want to be with that. I don't want to be separated from it. And attachment occurs. Or this is unpleasant. This is unattractive. I want to be separated from it. And so aversion arises. This is what our minds are doing throughout the day, right? Whenever we encounter various objects. This imputation of good or bad is mistaken. It is an incorrect perception because what is appearing is not the quality of the object at all. Rather, the mind mistakenly attributes those values onto the object, again, based upon the karmic experience that we are having with it. Other beings might have a totally different experience of that object, right? But because of that imputed quality, desire and attachment arise for attractive objects, while anger and aversion arise for unattractive objects. If you're not aware of what is going on, then once a sense consciousness engages its object, it seems that desire or anger arises uncontrollably. Right? It's just the natural process we go. We don't even think about it. It's the thing, as he mentioned in that previous slide, kind of the thought processes, but we don't actually sit down and think through that. It happens very instantaneously. When these mental afflictions, the inner enemies, suddenly jump out, there is no antidote. You have no way to restrain your mind. You know, when we're not paying attention, well, then we're just going to follow them. We're not going to do anything to counteract them. So that's the idea behind that. Let me go ahead and take it off screen. We'll go back to the text. But again, this is really, our job. There's that wonderful line from the Kadampa Geshe Ben Kongyo, where he says, standing at the door of the afflictions, holding the spear of the antidotes. Other than this, I have no other job. It's kind of like you have to be ready to apply some sort of antidotal mind. If we just let the mind go willy-nilly, crazy all over the place, we're not applying any antidotes, we're not doing anything to counteract the mind, then we're going to be distracted our entire day. And consequently, we're going to end up, again, getting back on our cushion with the mind even more agitated and disturbed than when we got off the cushion. So the idea is to continue to have some continuity of the presence of being, with holding those concepts and the ideas we've been meditating on, being attentive to what's going on in our mind so that we aren't following these delusions all over the place. So again, we'll study the antidotes to the delusions later on. But know that if you have any interest in pursuing, if you don't have that awareness of what these are, you can go to Kathleen McDonald's How to Meditate book, the one she wrote before the How to Meditate on the Stages of the Path to Enlightenment. That's the book we use for any of our beginning meditation classes. And she has a whole chapter on how to counteract the delusions through various thought processes and so on. But yeah, that's our job, one of our jobs. If we do that really well, then when we, again, get at least some strength of mind when we get back on our cushion so that we can hopefully, continue our meditation and strengthen the mind with the understandings that we gain through meditating on the Lamrim. The second of these is the actual acting with vigilance, which once more is another term for introspection. Sometimes this is also called guarding alertness. There's a quote from Master Shantideva's Entering the Bodhisattva Way. He says, to examine again and again the situation of mind and body. Exactly that, in brief, is what defines protecting vigilance, or again, guarding alertness. So following this, whenever the body and so forth engage in such and such an action, through understanding whether or not it should be pursued, you behave accordingly. So the idea is that this introspection or vigilance acts as another factor during our day to kind of keep an eye on what we're doing. We want to have kind of some guarding of the sense doors, but no doubt our minds will still wander in those directions if we don't have this kind of, again, spy. Introspection is sometimes referred to as sort of a spy in the corner of our minds that checks in occasionally. Like the other idea is like a security guard. A security guard has periods where they're just sitting down and having coffee and donuts or something. The security guard isn't walking around the property all the time, right? And that's kind of the idea behind our introspection. We don't want to have it there all the time because it kind of keeps us from doing whatever we're doing. It's sort of a distraction in some regard, but it's a useful distraction when it does need to be there. But you want it kind of checking in occasionally, just like a security guard will come by and see, oh, is this door still locked? And, whatever. They check for various things and then they take a little break. And then the next hour they go out and do it. I'm not saying wait an hour to do this, but we might have to wait a few minutes. If we're staying with the object or if we're staying present with what we're doing with mindfulness, and we are not getting caught up in these objects and attachment and anger arising, well, then we're doing our job. And introspection can take a break. But if introspection misses those things and isn't active, well, then, of course, we're going to start following those tendencies. So we need this force of introspection to kind of act as a backup. Maintain your mindfulness of what you need to be doing and being attentive to what the senses are doing and what have you. But when that fails and we suddenly are caught up in these patterns, we have to have something to notice that. Introspection is the factor that notices that, all right? So this is something I want to share a little bit from Geshe Sopa again in regard to this. The second of the 4 disciplines that's important for creating a productive context for practice is introspective alertness. Again, another way of referring to that with both words, introspection and alertness. The Tibetan word shejin means being aware of what is going on inside your mind. I usually call it the mental spy because this one corner of your mind vigilantly watches what you are doing all the time. He says all the time, but again, it's there maybe towards the beginning of your practice all the time, but it needs to be somewhat moderated because otherwise it can become, again, a bit of a distraction because then we're not doing what we need to do. Kind of continue doing what you're doing, but when introspection checks in, you might need to adjust things. Another way of expressing it is that introspective alertness is like a security guard, keeping an eye on the door, checking who is going in and who is going out to see if there is any danger, right? We're just kind of keeping an eye to make sure that our minds are doing what they need to be doing. If you don't vigilantly watch what you are doing and thinking while you go about your daily routines, it is like leaving the door to your house wide open without a guard. Robbers might come in and steal everything, or vandals could destroy everything inside, right? If we left home with just our door wide open, well, no one's there. They can come in and take whatever they want, right? The third, let's go on. Let's go back to our text before I go to the third one in regard to the slides. Let's see. The third one here in our text is knowing the right measure of food. We might not think that much of this, but actually, especially if you're going to be kind of trying to maintain a good mind for meditation, especially if you're on retreat, you have to be careful of what foods you eat because some of those can be quite disturbing and also can add to a more lethargic feeling or perhaps not giving us the strength that we need for meditation. Knowing the right measure of food, Tsongkhapa says, means to give up eating too much or too little, and to eat only the amount that does not damage your virtuous activities. Furthermore, having meditated upon the faults of craving food, remember what is said in the scriptures about eating. Thinking that it should be without a mental afflictions, you should try to eat without attachment or aversion towards the food that you're eating. Try to eat with a mind that is, partaking of it, but not getting caught up in, grasping at the pleasure if it's pleasurable, or having an aversion towards the unpleasant taste if it is maybe not the best food you've ever had. That it should benefit the giver, meaning that you should think while you are eating it, that you are trying to benefit the beings who are behind giving that to you, which can be somebody who's maybe given you the meal directly, but also those beings who are behind the scenes, who allow you to have the food that you have. So we think about others when we are eating. That while you now gather the microorganisms of your body by means of material things, in the future you will gather them by means of the Dharma. This is a third thought you can have. You can think, right now I am feeding the microorganisms of my body. I'm not just feeding me, this that I cling to so tightly with this body in mind, and I'm putting food into this body to feed me, but I'm feeding also the microorganisms. And in this time, I'm doing it with material things. In the future, I want to gather them, bring them into my sphere of influence by means of teaching them the Dharma, giving them the Dharma. So this is another thought that you can have that makes your eating of food much more virtuous and without attachment. And that you will lastly bring about the welfare of all sentient beings. This is another powerful thought, that you think that you're partaking of this food to, again, strengthen your body, give you what you need to be able to do more work, to move towards enlightenment so you can benefit all beings. There's a little quote from, there's a number of these now coming up from Nagarjuna's letter to a friend. This is verse 38. Reasoning that foodstuffs are like medicine, depend on them without attachment or hatred. Kind of treat your food as if it was medicine. They are not meant for you to be sated or haughty or fat, but just to keep your body going. It's kind of that's what we need to do. We need to put fuel in the tank, just like you put, fuel in the tank of a vehicle or what have you to keep it going. So that's the best attitude to have, is kind of see it as something that is functional. And yes, if it's delicious food, you can also do some kind of thoughts there. You can offer that pleasantness to other beings, right? Think, may they have a delicious, delightful food, whatever. All those sorts of things can be transformed. We don't have to cling to them with attachment. You can think about giving them away, giving them to the recipients, or I'm sorry, the givers who allowed you to receive this food. And they become the recipients of that as well, giving them to the microorganisms that you're feeding while you're feeding your body. We have lots of thoughts that we can add, even if it is delicious, delightful food, try not to get caught up in those patterns of attachment. And of course, if we're eating food that is not so good, well, then try not to get too angry and upset and just, recognize it's just a meal. Don't, whoops, sorry, I hit that mistakenly. Okay. So let's go to what Geshe Sopa says on this. He says the third of the four causes to easily produce single-pointed concentration and highest insight. Remember, those are the goals we want to accomplish over time through our meditation, is to know the proper measure of your diet. This is something we can all relate to. You should avoid the extremes. You should eat just what is suitable for your body, neither too little nor too much. You should eat healthy food, and your food should not increase your mental afflictions. These points are important for a serious practitioner. Now, I might mention that they say that, many deep meditative practitioners, those who have accomplished really deep states of meditation and retreat, that they don't need to eat so much because it becomes like the food of concentration. Their bodies are actually replenished through the practice that they do. And also, they're going to talk about sleep as the next one. Sleep is also something that great meditators don't seem to need very much of, if any. Lama Zopa Rinpoche is renowned for not sleeping at all. He would spend time kind of in meditation, sitting up, in the evening sometimes, but he would not actually go into deep sleep like we all do, laying down and what have you. These are states that are accomplished through deep meditation, where you actually have less of a reliance upon some of these external things, which is something, again, an advantage of those sorts of states of mind. But until we're there, we have to tend with food and eating food to kind of retain the strength of this body. And so we have to have a healthier way of relating to that. And then, of course, sleep. The next one, we also have to make sure that we're not sleeping at the wrong times, nor overindulging in sleep and what have you. So the last point of last of the four causes, is practicing earnestly without sleeping at the wrong time and behaving well when we do lie down to sleep. So again, a quote from Letter to a Friend, Lord of the Lineage, having practiced all day and in the first and last periods of the night, sleep with mindfulness between those periods, so that even your sleeping is not wasted. It's interesting, they divide the evening into 3 parts. The full day is divided into 6 parts, so it's essentially 6 parts of 4 hours each. And so, of course, during the day, you're supposed to practice. In the evening, the first 4 hours, the middle 4 hours, the last 4 hours. That's, from really half of your day, essentially. So it's not really usually half of our day, but nonetheless, heading into the evening, and then, of course, when it's dark at night, and then heading out of the evening into the morning. The 2 periods on either end of that, we don't want to be sleeping during, ideally. It's hard to survive on just 4 hours of sleep, but nonetheless, that's the traditional advice that's given. So let's go to the middle paragraph there. The actual sessions of both the entire day and during the first and last part of the night, as well as what should be done between them, have been explained. That's what when you're supposed to be practicing. Whether walking about or seated, completely purify your mind of the 5 hindrances, and thus make whatever you do meaningful. So these 5 hindrances are important to touch on. We don't want to go too deeply into them, but it is important that we try to refrain from getting caught up in those during our day as well. But this whole idea of kind of being awake as much as possible during your day. If you can't, have 4 hours of sleep a night, well, then maybe aim for like 5, 6, 7, something in that range. His Holiness the Dalai Lama, I think he even goes to bed sometime in the early evening, but he always gets up, they say, at like 3 o'clock in the morning to start his practice. So as he heads into dawn and what have you, he's already, been engaging in practice. But again, we do what we can. All of us have very different schedules, but so just moving into this topic, we first have a quote from Geshe Sopa. The fourth and last practice to create the conditions for easily obtaining realizations is to exert yourself in practice without sleeping very much. And when you do sleep, to do the appropriate practices related to sleep. We should walk about a bit and then sit on our meditation cushion and try to purify the mind of the 5 obscurations. This is from my teacher, Geshe Jampa Gyatso, when he taught on this. So this is important, again, just to know what these are. I'm not going to go into great detail to talk about how we counteract them, but just to be aware of them, that they can be hindrances to our having a productive day, especially in regard to our practice. The 5 obscurations are excitement and regret. Of course, excitement is the mind being attached to things as we are, going about our day or even doing our practice. Regret is the tendency to be sort of attracted or moving towards those things that we have some regret towards. Excitement towards the positive, regret towards the negative, if you will. Malice, of course, malice, a malicious mind, a mind of ill intent, what have you. This is not a good mind to be following during our day. It disturbs the mind greatly. Longing desire is the attachment, that element of it that can be prominent in our lives as well. We already talked about those two. Doubt. Doubt here is a kind of two-pointed nature of mind where we are unable to move forward because we haven't been able to resolve that doubt. That is kind of stuck with, is it this way or is it that way? We have to generally do deeper study and reflection to remove those doubts. And then lethargy and sleep. Of course, this is what we're talking about here, is, avoiding kind of a lethargic energy level to our day, as well as sleeping too much and not sleeping certainly when we're supposed to be practicing. We need to try to recognize them and to eliminate them. Then we should act meaningfully between sessions. So that's the idea behind those. Let me come back to this. But the idea of, again, sleep, we all are going to need some sleep until maybe we attain those states of deeper concentration, and concentration provides us with what we need to allow the body to have some level of regeneration and rest. But nonetheless, let's try to have, the healthiest mind that we can in regard to having to engage in that act as part of a good portion of every day that we have generally. So in terms of the next paragraph, it says the act of sleep takes place between sessions, again, between the last one of the one day and then the beginning of the next day, right? It's the earlier 4 hours of the night and then the last 4 hours as daylight is coming on. The physical act of sleeping consists in lying on your right side during the middle of those 3 periods of the night, again, those 4 hours, placing the left leg atop the right one, and sleeping like a lion. So this is often called the lion-like posture, and it's not called the lion-like posture because lions sleep that way. We'll see the explanation being given here in regard to why it's done that way. But again, some people find it difficult to sleep in that manner. If you can at least go to sleep in that way, that's said to be ideal. It's the posture that the Buddha is sometimes depicted in thangkas or statues as where he entered into parinirvana. And he's got his right hand underneath his right cheek, and he's laying on his right side. And then, of course, he's got the feet kind of up so that the left is on top of the right. And so essentially, this is said to be the posture the Buddha went into parinirvana in, and it's said to be a good posture to go to sleep in. Let me go through a little bit more advice on that posture, though, that comes from Geshe Sopa as well as Geshe Jampa Gyatso. You should lie on your right side with your left leg resting on top of your right leg. This specific posture for going to sleep is particularly relevant when you are in retreat or doing intensive practice. It was the way the Buddha was lying when he entered parinirvana. In other words, when he gave that appearance of dying. Buddhas don't really die, but that body, that appearance of the Buddha, showed the aspect of passing away. What is the correct conduct of the body? Geshe Jampa Gyatso says it is to lie down on our right side with the left leg placed on top of the right and the right hand against the right cheek. It is also advised, and this was kind of additional information, to block the right nostril with the tip of the right finger. Now it says right finger. I think it's usually the ring finger because I don't know, but you can use whatever finger. You want to kind of close that nostril if you can, as this stops the flow of wind that is related to attachment, whereby our sleep can become more virtuous. So again, that's just some additional advice that Geshe-la gave. This posture produces certain mental effects because of the way breath and energy flow through the body. When you sleep in this position, you will not sleep so heavily, kind of remain a little bit more in that mid-range of sleep, not so heavy, but, not to where you don't rest at all. You'll have, kind of that middle way again that we're aiming for so many times in our behavior. Even while you sleep, mindfulness and wisdom can still function. Your mind remains lighter and does not become totally dull and dark. Your dreams will be more peaceful. It would also be easier, for you to wake up if we have, again, not such heavy sleep. Some of us find that, right, if we go to sleep and waking up is such a challenge because we were sleeping so heavily. This allows you to have a bit lighter sleep. If you do not sleep this way, of course, the opposite may occur. Your sleep will be dark, mindless, and possibly disturbed by bad dreams. This position is called the lion posture. It's not called the lion posture because lions sleep this way, as I said. Rather, it is because lions are the most powerful, fearless, and have the loftiest minds among wild animals. They can subdue all the other beasts. So it's that kind of fearless quality, the power of, being the king of the animals, what have you. So in the same way, yogis who resolutely practice subduing evil thoughts, words, and actions all day, most of the night, and even while they sleep, will confidently overcome all obstacles. In that sense, they sleep like a courageous lion. So again, this whole thing of sleep and making our sleep virtuous, it is good to go to bed kind of reflecting on the very positive things that we've done and to have some virtuous mind as we go into sleep. If we've done our purification practice in that evening, well, then we've cleared up our mess. So we're not going to bed, hopefully, with a lot of regret over actions that we did. We've done what we needed to do to address those things. I might mention that Ribber Rinpoche, one of my teachers, didn't have the fortune to have that many teachings from him, but I did go to some, and he's was an amazing being. But he encourages people to practice Tonglen when you go to sleep. Most of you know this practice. If you don't, I won't have time to go into it tonight. It'll come into module or the part 3 of this course when we talk about the Bodhisattva path. It's a technique for developing compassion and love to feed into our bodhicitta motivation. And when you're going to bed, you're essentially breathing in any of the suffering of the world, to take that in, and then breathing out all of your happiness so that other beings can experience it. He said this makes your whole sleep virtuous so that you have that kind of giving them all your happiness, removing suffering, those minds of love and compassion kind of present in your continuum as you go to sleep. So anyway, just know that there's lots of other sleep yogas, dream yogas that exist. I'm not going to go into any of that, but if you have techniques that you use that you've been trained in, you can also do that. And that's a very powerful way to use your sleep as a means of practice. It is said that in your dreams, you don't collect quite as much of the karma in a heavy way that you do in your waking life, but there is still some karma generated. But you can do more virtuous things with your sleep, obviously, if you have more lucid awareness during your dreams and what have you. And of course, you won't get caught up in habitual patterns of delusions that might arise in the dreams. So now he goes on to talk a little bit about some of these other qualities that can be useful around sleep. He says, as for mindfulness, recollect until you fall asleep the predominant virtuous actions that you have cultivated during the day. Therefore, even while asleep, you can maintain whatever spiritual practice, such as concentration, you pursued when you were not asleep. I mean, another idea would be if you're going to sleep, for example, with thoughts about your spiritual master, your guru, then you can bring those thoughts and your dedication and your wanting to follow the advice of your guru into your sleep, so that kind of whatever you were meditating on during the day kind of is carried into your dream time. And then any topic you're meditating on, you could do that. As for vigilance, introspection, if any mental affliction arises while you are cultivating mindfulness, become aware of it and eagerly eliminate it rather than accepting it. Again, this is just another factor that these two work in tandem. Mindfulness being there to maintain our awareness, vigilance or introspection checking up to see if we need to adjust things, if we need to make changes. Then there is the notion of getting up, which is our own determination when we go to bed to project the thought, I will get up at this and that time, which is kind of like being your own internal alarm clock. I'm not saying if you have something important, don't set your alarm clock. It's probably not a bad idea, but people do get used to, if they are actually engaging in pretty regular sleep patterns, getting themselves up at a particular time. It is kind of a habitual thing that we can do by projecting that thought. Well, I'm going to get up at 5 a.m. or I'm going to get up at 4 a.m. or I'm going to get up at 6 a.m. or whatever. And then we get up and we actually, are able to use that time meaningfully. Then it says, to wrap up this section, apart from the unique aspects of each meditation during the actual yoga, these instructions on these four, what should be done in preparation during the actual meditation, at the end and between sessions, the between sessions being those four. So those four, as well as everything else we've covered in this chapter up to this point, should be applied to every object and its aspects, from here all the way up to the final topic in the Lamrim, usually, which is the special insight, the insight into emptiness. So essentially, everything we covered up to this point is relevant in your daily practice in regard to when you're on the cushion and, preparation time, whatever, as well as between sessions. So just keep that all in mind. Now we're getting into a last little kind of closing section where we're looking at this whole idea of the types of meditation and the really two types of practice that we need to engage in. And I always encourage people in their meditation practice to have some element of both of these. Obviously, they culminate in the deeper states of meditation of calm abiding and special insight. And we'll look at that as this part of this chapter unfolds. So we have a quote first from the ornament for the Mahayana Sutras. It says here, first of all, proper mental attention arises in dependence and reliance, upon study. And from proper mental attention, again, arises the wisdom with ultimate reality as its object. So I put a little note there, which is essentially just saying these are the three wisdoms. We've talked about these. I think we touched on these before. This is what we're trying to do in our path, essentially, is the three types of wisdom. The first one being that which is arisen from hearing or study, that arisen from thinking, or what was called here proper mental attention, and that which arises from meditation, from meditating. So what this is referring to is that essentially, if we say, okay, the goal is to get to these realizations, as we saw when we looked at that, we looked briefly at Pabanka Rinpoche's instructions on how to meditate on the stages of the path. I touched on that, and I encourage you to take a look at some teachings I gave on that at another time, and to read through that document, especially the beginning part. It explains in there how to move your realizations so that they become experiential realizations that are really going to change everything for your mind and your ability to incorporate the Dharma. Essentially, that is what we're aiming for, and especially to end up with a direct realization, particularly of emptiness, that special insight that we need to have. So essentially, what we're going to be talking about is what are the meditations and what do we need to do to get to that destination? Because if that's really the goal that we want to accomplish through our daily practice, is to be able to have the deep level of meditative awareness so that we can engage in meditating on emptiness, have that direct insight and realization so that we can, begin to remove the afflictions from our own minds, the ignorance that is there, be able to move towards enlightenment and become a Buddha for the sake of all beings. Well, what do we all need for that process? The very first part of this is just highlighting that we have these three levels of wisdom. You don't get wisdom from meditation just on its own. Where does your wisdom from meditation come from? That deeper insight into the nature of things? From having properly thought about things, this proper mental attention, which means the reflection that we need to do on the teachings that we receive, which is the first level of this whole process of wisdom. It all starts when you are hearing teachings like tonight, or reading books like the books that we have that support our study, or going to, any sort of, resource that's going to provide information on the topics that you're studying. When you get that information, that's already a level of wisdom. It's already pointing you in the right direction. It's sort of kind of like a correct belief. It's sort of giving you some idea of what the proper information is. You need to then investigate those teachings. That's the second level. Again, we often call this the wisdom arisen from reflection or thinking. but it's what was being called in our text proper mental attention. It means you're going to actually investigate these teachings to see the truth of them for yourself. If you don't do that step, well, then you can never get to the third step, which is then through the familiarity with those topics and having deepened your confidence in them and what have you through your reflection to actually acquire the wisdom that arises from meditation. What we are doing in our meditation now is more akin to the second level. When we sit down, we might hear these teachings as we're doing in this course, read them, go and read other material, and then we sit in meditation, meditating on devoting to the spiritual guide or perfect human rebirth, the next topic, or all the other topics we're going to see throughout the Lamrim. Those are all coming down the pike, right? Every one of them is meant to be investigated in that way. That's what we're doing in the second step, essentially, through what we call our meditation, which is meditation. It's just not yet the wisdom arisen from meditation. Wisdom arisen from meditation does require that you have a much more stable mind of concentration. And of course, the stablest mind that we need to have, at least to gain that wisdom arisen from meditation, is the mind of calm abiding that is united with some level of special insight so that we can attain those realizations and once more transform our minds. So the process is quite simple. This is what we're engaging in all of our Buddhist activities, is either you are acquiring some wisdom through hearing, studying, what have you, meditating on it, reflecting on it, thinking about it to gain greater confidence in it, or eventually through deeper concentration, causing that wisdom to be there in a much more definitive way so that it totally transforms our minds. Eventually, it kind of helps you to attain those realizations that will be essential to attain in order to be removed from samsara yourself as well as to accomplish Buddhahood. So let's go back to the text after that explanation. It says, that is to say, based on that passage, it's sort of a commentary on that, from proper mental attention, or, thinking, reflecting on these subjects very deeply, gained through the arising of wisdom, reflecting on the meaning of what has been studied, a direct realization of ultimate reality that comes from meditation arises. You're never going to get to that direct realization that wisdom arisen from meditation if you haven't done the second step. But of course, you don't get to the second step if you haven't done the first step. All three wisdoms are, involved in each other. During the stages of definitive analysis, this is from the Ornament for Clear Knowledge, as well as the paths of seeing and meditation, one must repeatedly reflect, assess, and ascertain. These are the paths of meditation. So this I actually have a footnote on because I preferred a translation of this that I'm going to share on the screen shortly in the slides. That's from the Lamrim Chenmo, the translation of the Great Treatise. But let's go to the slides because I also have a little bit more on those three wisdoms, not a lot, but just kind of reasserting what they are so you can hear someone else explain them. Maybe that'll be helpful. There are three types of wisdom, Geshe Sopa says, and they arise sequentially. The wisdom that arises from hearing, again, that includes studying, all of the ways that we acquire information, reading. The wisdom that arises from thinking, reflecting, again, what was called proper mental attention, and the wisdom that arises from meditating. It is the wisdom arising from meditation that realizes the ultimate truth, emptiness, and thereby severs the root cause of suffering. Therefore, this type of wisdom is our desired goal. It can only be developed based on the foundation of the earlier two types of wisdom. Without it, it cannot exist. You can't develop it on its own because it requires the wisdom of hearing and the wisdom of thinking before it can be realized. This is that different translation of that verse that we just had from Venerable Maitreya. It says, as for the branch of certain differentiation, which refers to the path of preparation. Remember the 5 paths? I talked about them a while ago. That's the second level, the second path. As for the branch of certain differentiation that occurs in that path of preparation, the path of seeing, which is our direct insight into emptiness in an initial way, that's the third of the 5 paths, and the path of meditation, the fourth of the 5 paths. It is repeated reflection, comprehension, and definite discernment that constitute this path of meditation. It's not referring specifically to the path of meditation, but it's saying that our path of meditation arises from these factors. You won't get to these levels of realization, even the first one on the path of preparation, much less the direct insight into emptiness on the path of seeing and path of meditation, without reflection, comprehension, and then definite discernment through our engaging in these three levels of wisdom. Maitreya says that repeated reflection, comprehension, and definite discernment constitute the path of meditation for a Mahayana noble being, a bodhisattva. In light of this, it is ridiculous to claim that meditation and sustained analysis are contradictory. So if we are to meditate on things, we have to do that and we have to include in that the analysis of things. This is, again, coming up in this whole argument. I haven't really reached it yet in the text. There's a whole argument that's coming up that is essentially saying these are two different types of meditation then. We've been mainly focusing and looking at these three wisdoms, kind of how do we develop a deeper analytical insight into things? That's the analytical meditation side of things. And I talked about these two earlier in this course, right? Then you have the stabilizing part of meditation, which is where you make the mind single-pointedly focused. And we always want to incorporate some level of that practice. And moreover, we want to eventually take that to some culmination in the mind of calm abiding by being able to make the mind single-pointedly focused on whatever object we wish. So these two might be seen as somewhat contradictory, right? Our stabilizing meditation is what many people call meditation. It is making the mind focused on the breath or some other object, letting the distractions go so that we're not wandering outward, as well as keeping the mind very alert and attentive so it doesn't become dull and lethargic. It's finding that kind of middle way path to attaining a very stable and very clear mind. Those two factors of stability and clarity are essential. That is a whole practice in and of itself. And it seems contradictory to the wisdom of analysis, right? Because then we're using discursive thought and we're thinking about the teachings and we're analyzing things and trying to come to conclusions. And it seems like that whole process and what's going on over here in making the mind single-pointedly are almost totally unrelated. But again, we're going to see that we need kind of the basis of the stabilizing meditation in order to engage in any deeper analysis. These are kind of complementing each other. Even when we engage in an analysis, we want to have many of the same kind of principles of stabilizing meditation present. In other words, we don't want the mind getting distracted outward, nor do we want the mind becoming dull and not so clear. We want to have those same factors present in both types of meditation. So with that introduction, let's go back to our text and take a look at what is said there. So at the very bottom, Tsongkhapa says, that is to say, repeated reflection, evaluation, and definitive understanding are paths of meditation for Mahayana Aryas, again, for the Bodhisattvas. A quote from Shantideva's Compendium of Trainings says, thus you should meditate continuously on all kinds of giving away, guarding, purifying, and increasing your body's possession and merit. In other words, he's saying it's even good to meditate on some of these activities and things that we, again, would normally consider to be much more discursive. And I do have another alternate translation with some commentary from the great treatise, just to clarify what that is referring to, which is kind of what I was just saying, but let's go to that anyway. When I put this all together for the last class, I said some of these things I think are useful for us to kind of get a different take on these from the Lamrim Chenmo, from Tsongkhapa's longer Lamrim text. He says, you should not think that meditation, this is again from Geshe Sopa's commentary on that, you should not think that meditation then has a limited scope. It's actually very extensive and inclusive. In other words, we bring meditation into everything that we do in terms of our analysis and our activities and what have you. In the Compendium of Training, Shantideva said, therefore you should constantly meditate on giving, protecting, purifying, and increasing your body, wealth, and merit, whichever is appropriate. Here, even actions such as giving are called meditation. In short, these two texts teach, both the text by Maitreya and the one by Shantideva, teach that both kinds of meditation are necessary to practice the stages of the path. And it's not dependent upon one or the other, it's dependent upon both, done in tandem. Analytical meditation, I'll go to the text where these are explained again, but I wanted to go ahead since we're on the slides and go through what's said here by Geshe Sopa. Analytical meditation is the process of examining various points of view until you thoroughly establish the truth. Tsongkhapa provides a list of some of the topics that are primary examples of analytical meditation. Faith in your spiritual teacher, what we covered a few weeks ago, right? The great importance of a human life, what we're going to cover next week. Death and impermanence, karma and its effects, the faults of cyclic existence, those we'll cover in part 2. And bodhicitta, we'll cover that in part 3. Without analytical meditation, you cannot achieve any of the realizations that are necessary steps on the path. We have to analyze these topics and get to know them very deeply so we can gain realizations of them. So then, what is stabilizing meditation? You practice stabilizing meditation in order to bring your wild mind under control. Ordinarily, your mind is kind of wild. It is always running here and there. It cannot stay on any particular object even a moment. Something we become aware of when we start our meditation practice, whenever that started for you, probably many years ago for many of you. You could see how wild the mind was when you first started to just try to observe the breath. Mind is crazy, right? Going all over the place. Through the practice of stabilizing meditation, your mind will become very flexible and completely under your control. With a special kind of confidence, you will be able to concentrate on whatever you wish without any interruption for as long as you desire. That's kind of a good way of describing what the state of calm abiding is. And of course, there's also this idea of the flexibility, the pliancy or serviceability of body and mind that occurs then. That's the goal of our stabilizing meditation. It allows us then to engage in proper analytical meditation. These two, again, are very complementary, and we practice, again, as I was saying a short while ago, some of the same techniques in our analytical meditation to make sure that we can have good stabilizing meditation. So analytical and stabilizing meditations must be joined together to truly integrate your realizations with your mind. In analytical meditation, the main thing is to engage the object with determination for a long time. The clarity of the image of the object is not so important. It's the idea you want to stay with it. You don't want to necessarily kind of get lost and lose what you're meditating on, right? The clarity of the image is what comes in with stabilizing. In contrast, he says, stabilizing meditation involves seeing the aspects of the object clearly. It is from the combination of analytical and stabilizing meditation, then, that you will be able to achieve what you seek, a proper mental attitude, wisdom, and completion of the path. If we want to achieve, well, let me hold off on this. That's some practice advice from Geshe Jampa Gyatso. Let's go to our text then with this understanding of these two types of meditations, because there's a few different points that are raised that are kind of saying, well, you know, some people hold that it's this way. Some people hold it's another way. And we'll talk about a few of those. So in the middle of the screen there, with regard to the meditations that, according to the statement, should be done on the basis of each of the three, bodies, possessions, and roots of virtue, in connection with all four activities of giving away, guarding, purifying, and increasing, there are both kinds. So he's essentially saying, based on that quote of Shantideva, that there are both kinds of meditation, stabilizing and analytical. There's analytical meditation, which is practiced by analyzing with the wisdom of fine investigation. And there is placement meditation, in which the mind is placed single-pointedly without analysis, which makes them, again, sound contradictory, but they are totally complementary. Now, what kind of path is analytical meditation? And what kind of path is placement meditation? For meditations such as the cultivation of faith in the spiritual teacher, the same topics we just looked at, the preciousness of the freedoms, endowments of this human life and how difficult it is to find them, death and impermanence, actions and their effects, karma, the faults of cyclic existence, and the cultivation of bodhicitta, analytical meditation is necessary. You have to get to know those topics if you're going to realize them, right? So you have to analyze them. Each of them requires an awareness that has great strength and the ability to subdue the mind for a long time, because if those are absent, their counterparts, disrespect for the spiritual teacher, not seeing the preciousness of this life and wasting it and so on, all of these counterparts cannot be prevented. The whole point of it is we're trying to correct our minds to have the realizations of what is accurate versus the mistaken ideas that we follow. Also, the generation of such an awareness depends on nothing but the meditation repeatedly analyzing through fine investigation. So this is, you're going to gain the realization by meditating repeatedly on these topics, gaining the realizations. Remember when I went through that text by Pabanka Rinpoche, I think I don't need to pull it up. You're quite familiar with it, hopefully by now. He talks in the beginning about how we engage in proper analytical meditation. And the whole goal is, once more, this concept of what we mean by the word ngam or meditation, to become familiar with. But you can't become familiar with things without those three wisdoms supporting it. And you can't actually become the most familiar through the wisdom arisen from meditation unless you have deep concentration, that stability of mind. But the wisdom is acquired through an analysis, through hearing the teachings, thinking about them, reflecting on them, meditating on them eventually at a deeper level. If you don't do those things, you can't possibly gain the realization of any of those topics, realizations that are all set out again in that advice from Pabanka Rinpoche, at least for the first several topics of the Lamrim. He doesn't go on to, present all of them beyond, I think, refuge, I think is the last topic that he has in there. And we get an example. For example, just as intense, this is always, I find, an interesting example, how we're already using analytical meditation, but we're using it around the delusions in a sense. For example, just as intense attachment arises when you closely familiarize yourself with an object of attachment, exaggerating its pleasant features. So intense hatred arises when you think repeatedly of the many unpleasant features of an enemy. So we have these two kind of patterns of attachment and anger that are arising based on our own kind of meditative analysis, like looking at things and thinking about their positive qualities again and again. So we get so attached to them, or looking at things or people and thinking about their negative features so that we have more and more anger arising towards them. So in the case of cultivating these paths, these virtuous paths, no matter whether the image of the object appears clearly, the mind's way of apprehending it must be intense and long lasting. And this requires analytical meditation. That's what you need analytical meditation for, is to sustain your awareness on those things because you become familiar with them through, again, that process of having introduced them to the mind, through hearing, reflecting on them to strengthen your understanding of them, and then eventually uniting it with deeper concentration to gain the wisdom arisen from meditation. Now, in regard to the other one, the stabilizing practice that culminates in shamatha, calm abiding, in the context of practicing shamatha, which enables you to place the mind on whatever object you wish, someone whose mind has been unable to stay on one object will not be able to generate shamatha if they keep analyzing, and the placement meditation is required for that. So in other words, if you do take the mind off of the object by analyzing, well, then you are going to interrupt the continuity of staying with that object. What you're trying to do in shamatha is to keep the mind on the object for as long as you can. And again, in the final part of this course, we'll go into the steps for developing calm abiding. There are 9 mental stages we go through that eventually culminate in this mind of calm abiding. But if you're constantly moving the mind all over the place, then you're not going to have much luck in sustaining that awareness of the object that allows you to kind of pursue making the mind very, very stable and clear, kind of able to have, again, a very clear awareness of what is appearing to it. But again, it's not to say that you don't require some analysis in there. We even do use some analysis in order to help correct things that are going on in our mind that are taking us off the object. And we'll see that coming up as part of the advice given here. But these two, again, are part and parcel of gaining realizations. You are doing them in tandem, if you will. And I think I may have mentioned this when we talked about doing meditation in the actual session part of it. But you are going to introduce stabilizing meditation. This is how we generally do a meditation on a Lamrim topic, where you make the mind as focused as you can by focusing on the breath or some other object. Then you analyze. Having let go of some of that distraction and heighten the awareness of the mind, you then analyze that particular topic, again, such as the topic of the spiritual teacher, or again, the perfect human rebirth that we're going to go into next week. Then when you get to the conclusion of the meditation, which again, in regard to the perfect human rebirth, as we'll see, there are some conclusions we can come to, but the main one is to recognize that this life is so precious and so opportune, and we have to use it well. We can't waste this human life. We can't even waste a moment of this human life. That's the conclusion you want to come to. When you get to that conclusion, then you stabilize on that. You don't go back to the breath. You make that your object so that you try to take that understanding of it more deeply into your mind. Now, of course, when you have fully qualified shamatha and this mind that can abide on the object as long as you wish, well, then this process is going to really take off, right? Because you can stay with whatever it is you're meditating on with your analysis, as well as the conclusion you come to with great power and force. That's where you really change the mind. But again, this is further down the road that we'll have these skills and abilities. Maybe some of you have them now, but I can speak for myself and say, no, I don't have those yet. So let's carry on, and then we'll see if we have a little bit of time for questions before our discussion. I think we're just about done here. Maybe not. We might have to come to some of this a little bit later. Let me just do this first part that's in yellow here and talk about that a bit, and then that may be all we have time for tonight. We'll finish off this section next week. There's not much left. Some who do not understand this approach may claim that if you are a scholar, you should only do analytical meditation, right? That makes some sense. If you're spending all this time investigating the teachings, hearing teachings from great masters, what have you, then you're a scholar, you're pursuing the scholarly track, well, then you just do analytical meditation. Well, if you are a sadhu, I might mention that there are other translations for this term. It's referred to as a yogi simply in Geshe Sopa's book. And in the translation of the great treatise, it's referred to as an adept. But the idea is that there are beings who do spend more of their time engaged in deeper practices. I think sadhu might be used here because, again, that is the meditation techniques that we're going to be looking at when we get to the topic of the developing shamatha, come out of the Hindu tradition, the Vedic traditions, right? So all of that was what the Prince Siddhartha practiced with these great meditation masters, to spend most of their time in meditation, even to the point of ignoring the body and really trying to place their minds in deep, deep concentration. So again, whether you call it a sadhu or a yogi or an adept, the idea is that you have some people who spend their time doing that type of meditation. And if so, then you should only do that. You only do placement. This is not correct, though, because each of them needs to do both. Scholars also need to achieve shamatha, and sadhus also need to achieve strong faith in the spiritual teacher and the like. Regardless of where you fall on that fence of more scholarly or more of a practitioner that wants to engage in deep meditation, you need both if you're ever going to make any progress on the path. Therefore, the idea that repeated analysis using the wisdom of fine investigation belongs to the context of study and reflection rather than to the context of practice is incorrect. Okay. Maybe I'll do one more because I think this is actually on your homework as well. This other kind of objection can be brought forward. That's kind of one of them. Well, I thought that if you're this type of person, you only do stabilizing, and if you're that type of person, you only do analytical. Here, the idea is, as it says at the bottom of the screen, the notion that all thought, all conceptuality involves apprehending signs, meaning that it is seeing things as inherently existent, and therefore creates obstacles to enlightenment. That notion has the fault of not differentiating between, sorry, I was trying to get my little thing off my screen so I could read that. Differentiating between improper mental attention, apprehending true existence, and proper mental attention, thinking of reality. So again, what it's saying there is that some people may have the idea, and this actually was a bit of a debate point when the Buddha Dharma came to Tibet. There was an influence, of course, from India. The Nalanda tradition is what His Holiness always attributes the Tibetan Buddhist tradition to, this coming out of India, this very powerful, grounded in the teachings of the great Indian masters, Nagarjuna and so on. And then there was an influence from the East, which was the Chinese Buddhism, which was adopting a bit more of what has come to be practiced there, as well as in the Zen tradition, which tends to be more yogi-based, kind of sadhu-based sort of practices and what have you. But this idea of like, does using your conceptual mind become an obstacle to attaining enlightenment or not? Many people engage in practice where they're trying to empty the mind of conceptual thought. And there was a debate that took place in Tibet between Kamala Shila, who brought some teachings to Tibet in that sort of initial wave after Shantarakshita, and he was debating with Hashang Mahayana, which was this great Chan Buddhist master, because Buddhism had been in China for many, centuries before it came to Tibet. So they were debating over this whole idea. Is conceptual mind the problem or the solution? Or both? But In the end, of course, we want to achieve non-conceptual awareness. When it comes to our direct realization of emptiness, the wisdom arisen from meditation, that is the view of the ultimate truth at the deepest level, you can't have a conceptual mind present. You need to have it be non-conceptual. But how do you get to this? Do you get to that through emptying the mind of all concepts, not thinking of any concepts at all? Or do you do it through using your conceptual mind as a ladder to get to that realization? Conceptuality eventually falls away, but you got there through using your conceptual mind. This is a debate again that they had on these in this area of Tibet between these two great masters. Kamala Shila, my teacher, always said he won the debate by essentially saying, "Isn't the thought of not having concepts a thought?" So he kind of turned it around on Hashang Mahayana and said essentially, even you're thinking you're not having a thought is a thought. So, don't think that you can get rid of thought. And anyway, this is the tradition that remained in Tibet, even though there was, some residue of these views of non-conceptual awareness is what we're aiming for. And so therefore, we're just going to practice that. That carried on for some time. But in general, we use this view that your conceptual mind, you do want to lose it at some point when you gain a direct realization. But in the meantime, it is that ladder. It is what will help you to move in that direction to being able to actually have the direct realization of emptiness. Okay. That's the idea behind that. And it's just about time for our discussion. But let me see if there is maybe one or two questions before we go. I said I would talk about the questions from last week, but didn't do it yet. Sorry. Anyone have anything from tonight? What I will do, let me go ahead and go to where I have those questions. There were two things I think that came up in that last class, and I'll just try to answer those real quickly, or at least take a look at what my thoughts were on them, because there was one of them, I think, it had to do with let's see, drafts right here. I just threw those questions into a draft folder. It wanted to do with the mandala offering, and I think Mary had answered the question initially around you kind of position the sun and the moon in different directions depending upon where you are offering the mandala. And I think that is true. I mean, I think there's ideas of kind of an outward one where you're kind of offering it to the beings who are in front of you, or an inward one where you are offering it to yourself in the form of a deity and what have you. So it does seem like there are different, representations of various things in terms of, what is all being placed in what direction. Then, of course, the sun and the moon, I don't know. I didn't really find anything more specific about them in terms of which way they are going. If you have them in the east and west when you are placing the mandala, or if they're in the north and south of the mandala pattern. So sorry, I didn't find out anything much more about that. I took a look at the materials, but I didn't see anything. There is actually, I just noticed that there's a new book that's going to be coming out later this year of Rinpoche's teachings on mandala offerings. So maybe there'll be an answer there. And then the five spokes and the five vajras, I actually did find a little passage that did relate those. Let me go ahead and share that on screen. I think it'll be, well, actually, I can go ahead and read it. If you go to the Rigpa Wiki, which is a wiki page that is set up by Rigpa, the Sogyal Rinpoche's organization, talks there about it, calls it the double vajra. It says the double vajra is a crossed vajra formed from four lotus-mounted vajra heads that emanate from a central hub toward the four cardinal directions, and symbolizes the principle of absolute stability. It also, he says, it mentions later that they are correspond to the five elements, as well as the Buddhas of the five families. And blue Akshobhya is in the center, and he didn't go on to explain who was the other. Oh, no, it is. Yeah. It's also an emblem. No, it's not there. Sorry. I knew I found this, but I hadn't gone back to kind of check all the information. But know that there is some correspondence. We use the double vajra again across like this as like the basis for a throne. And so it does have some aspect, because somebody asked, is it related to the five Buddha families? And it does seem like that is one reference to it. I'll put that link in the chat box in case you want to take a look at it. It's just a little passage from, again, Rigpa Wiki, and you can take a look there if you want more information. So sorry, I didn't find out anything more on the sun and the moon, but it does seem like there is some difference in things, as Mary said, depending upon uh, where it's being offered. Okay, there is the link to the Double Vajra page at Rigpa Wiki. All right, let's take just a few minute break, 3 minutes, 4 minutes, something like that. And let's come back for the discussion. Again, those of you who have to leave at this time, please dedicate all the positive potential you've created for your enlightenment. And those of you who can come back, we are going to work with the questions that are on homework 8, which I'll put on the screen very briefly right now. I think we covered everything that we need to in regard to answering those. At least through number 3. There's only 3 questions. Okay, so you've got 3 questions. You can talk about those over the remainder of the time. Again, we'll come back in 5 minutes before we end. Okay, thank you. I got it. The one time I didn't have it quite right, so. All right. Any comments from the discussion? I guess pretty much it was maybe everyone who's here other than Alice and Mary Jo. Mary Jo, I think you were there a little bit, but um, anyone have anything they want to share in regard to Stephen in the Gompa here? The group disappeared in the Gompa here. We had a few people who needed to drive a distance and they took off. And so anyway. All right. Nothing anyone needed to share in regard to these. Let's just look at in our group, we didn't really get to the other two. We spent the time on the first question. If we look at that second question, we're just to review, we're talking about those 2 types of meditation that we went into. The placement meditation or stabilizing meditation, which culminates in calm abiding, which, by the way, it's not the end of the line for calm abiding. You can go on to develop even deeper states of meditative stabilization, or samadhi, as it's often called in the Sanskrit. And there's the 4 concentrations that are absorptions beyond that, and then also the 4 formless absorptions, which are kind of even deeper meditative states that are in that nature of single-pointed meditation. But anyway, that's one part of our practice, and the other part is the analytical meditation. And again, they're differentiated by Tsongkhapa in those passages that we went through. I don't need to go through it all, but obviously discursive thought is contrary to the stabilizing, whereas again, we use the analytical meditation to engage in deeper investigation into the topic. So those 2, again, have different purposes in what they're trying to create in the mind, but yeah, they're meant to be complementary, as I emphasized when we went through that topic. Please explain refutation of the notion that all thought involves apprehending signs and therefore creates obstacles to enlightenment. That's what I went through right at the end. And again, we can see that if you hold that view and you just try to eliminate conceptual mind, well, in the view of this particular tradition, which again, I don't want to start getting into a battle over who's right and who's wrong, but if you look at it from the point of view of what we're studying, well, then if you never use your conceptual mind to get your head around all these concepts, and particularly to get your head around emptiness, well, then how will you realize emptiness simply by having a non-conceptual mind, but not having the object of emptiness appear to it? It seems a little strange to me, but in the Zen tradition, it does seem like they have satori, these moments of enlightened awareness of emptiness or something that occur. And I don't know how to explain those things, but it does seem contrary to what we're talking about here, where everything is tending to be, built on this structure of I think about things to gain more familiarity with them, and then eventually I can attain kind of crossing that bridge over into a direct awareness, a non-conceptual awareness, especially of emptiness. But any other comments in before we conclude or questions? Yeah, Elijah.
Yeah, I'm kind of wondering because like what you were saying at the end, most things I've seen in Tibetan Buddhism is just going up to like calm abiding and not into the further concentration. So I'm kind of wondering like why that is.
Mhm. Well, it is said that the bodhisattvas may develop those states of mind as a way of training their mind to be very kind of dexterous and moving all over the place, being very concentrated in a variety of ways, because each of them have different qualities. As you deepen that meditation, you lose some certain factors and other ones become enhanced. And even when you get to like the 4th concentration, which is actually said to be the ideal support for realizing emptiness, you have more or less a mind of equanimity, then you don't really even have the kind of blissful or joyful states that arise in calm abiding through like the first three concentrations. So I don't know why it isn't taught there. I mean, it seems like calm abiding is the bare minimum that you need for combining it with special insight. We often call these the union of calm abiding and special insight. That's the basis you need for a conceptual realization of emptiness to begin with at a very deep level that will be part of your path, your progress into from the path of accumulation to the path of preparation. Then to go from preparation to path of seeing, you absolutely can have that support of union of calm abiding and special insight, and it becomes non-conceptual. So they always set it out that way. And of course, it means any form of a meditative stabilization that's calm abiding and higher. And you could use any of those as a support, though it says when you get into the four formless absorptions, those minds are not ideal for deeper realizations because they become really quite subtle and not so good at differentiation at times. So probably the fourth concentration is set out as like this ideal basis, but nonetheless, in all the teachings, they just emphasize calm abiding because I guess maybe they don't want to freak people out, make people think they have to practice much more deeply than what they already have. Already to attain calm abiding is quite an achievement, but I don't know. I'm just guessing. That's not like the words of Tsongkhapa or anything. That's the words of Don guessing. But it does seem interesting that they don't teach those really. You have to study some of the deeper philosophical texts to get into a whole explanation of those. There's some really good books out there about those states of meditation, but yeah, they do seem to require a lot more deepening of one's practice well beyond what it takes to generate calm abiding. So I don't know. We all just, if we get to calm abiding, we'll be happy to have attained that. Maybe we'll feel at that point we need to go further. I think there is, of course, in the Vedic traditions, there's an idea that you get to these deeper and deeper places and you actually reach some form of moksha or liberation just by virtue of the meditative state. And of course, in Buddhism, we're just saying, the meditative states are just a tool. You have to realize emptiness in order to attain any sort of liberation. So. Okay, let's go ahead. Thank you for that question, Elijah. Yeah, let's go ahead and wrap up tonight. And if you have further questions, again, jot them down. Hopefully, have a chance to ask them. Maybe the final class might be just filled with questions because I haven't had a chance to go through a lot of this stuff. But let's put on the screen the prayers, and let's begin with the dedication prayer that we usually use. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish, but increase more and more. And then the prayer for His Holiness, as we recite this, think that we're creating the causes for all of our spiritual guides to have good health, long lives, and all their holy wishes to be fulfilled immediately. The wish-granting, wish-fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world, to the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. Then the prayer for Rinpoche's reincarnation to be identified and for everything to be auspicious for that being to be of incredible benefit to all the beings of this world and beyond. Peerless teacher and assembly of the children of the victorious ones, Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas, victorious Losang, father and sons, along with the lineage masters, all the objects of refuge of infinite lands, please bestow the virtue and goodness of accomplishing this prayer here and now. Holding and spreading the Muni's precious and complete teachings through explanation and practice, you are the armor of patience that is never discouraged. Incomparable Venerable Guru, to you I make request. While striving single-pointedly for the sake of the victorious one's teachings, the sole gateway through which all benefit and happiness emerge, and from other living beings you suddenly departed to peace. What a great loss. Nevertheless, through the undeceiving truth of the blessings of the ocean of the three jewels, and the great waves of bodhicitta of the children of the victorious ones, may the smile of a reincarnation swiftly beam in glory for fortunate disciples. Lastly, we dedicate for all the beings that we're holding in our hearts, that they may be free of their suffering, whoever those beings are, whether they're ones that we know and can clearly see their situation, or even those who we can think about who are in parts of the world where there's war, harm from the elements, and so on. Send this positive energy out to those beings who you're thinking of right now. Let it become the cause for them to be free from their suffering immediately and all the causes of their suffering. And also for them to have all the perfect causes that will lead to the development of their minds all the way to enlightenment. And dedicate that all beings may have these same results through what we have done here tonight. Okay, thank you all for tuning in tonight. And again, we'll continue on for the next number of Sunday or of Wednesdays. I don't know why I said Sunday. I'll be teaching Sundays here in April, 3 of them, but anyway, that's another story. So everyone be well, study well, and again, we'll reconvene next Wednesday. Okay, bye-bye.